All right, good morning. Have you guys had classes all the way through 7, 8, 9, 10? All right, nobody's had 3 classes then up to now, okay. I just want to see who's the most wasted in the class by now. This is my heavier day. I had 2 other classes today, but all right. So we will have a word of prayer, and we're going to jump into this. And again, the setting here, I'm kind of adjusting. I have to be able to see this too, so I may end up turning around a little bit. We'll get it figured out by the middle of the semester, all right? Let's pray. Thank you, Father, for these students. Thank you for the privilege of engaging in this study, and I pray that you would be greatly honored and help us to learn and to grow through the things that we consider. I pray in Jesus' name, amen. Yeah, I'm going to sit with, I just have to make sure that the camera can see where I'm sitting there. Okay, all right. Now, actually, if I sit over on this side, I don't have to bend my head as far to see what I want to see. All right. I would be doing you a disservice if we started this course just by talking about cultural anthropology without explaining how cultural anthropology fits into other types of anthropology, okay? And we did mention last class period the difference between this and studying in systematic theology or Bible doctrine, right? But I'm going to go a little different direction here with this. There is a very serious archaeological study of anthropology, which involves what? Study of artifacts and you know, what kind of houses did people live in? How did they get their water? So you're looking at artifacts and hints to help us understand how man, anthropos, lived, okay? You dig up weapons of war, you make conclusions about, you know, the struggles they experienced and stuff like that, okay? Right, that's archaeological anthropology. And then there's biological anthropology, which studies what? Yeah, life, and specifically the way that people looked, the way they were built. Were they tall, were they short, were they dark, were they light? What kinds of features on their faces and their bodies stood out? That's the biological aspect. What do we discern about their lifespan at that time? Okay, that's more the biological anthropology. The third one is the one that we are studying, cultural anthropology, which has to do with the society itself, okay? People's values, their beliefs, their customs, all right? So they're all tied together. And then the final one is one I would like to get into more here at Faith, and maybe in the future we will, and that is linguistic anthropology, the languages of people, communication, all right? Speaking, writing, that sort of thing. So when you talk about anthropology, there are a number of directions you can go. But in this course, we are going to be talking more about culture itself, okay, and how people develop their cultural customs and beliefs and all that. Make sense? All right. So there is a, I thought that was cute. I found that online. I decided I'd go with it. All right. Now, in your class notes, you should have something that looks like this. It's a cutout that I actually found in an article called Understanding Culture by Lloyd Quast. And he's a student of culture, a believer. And there are a number of ways that you can dissect culture, but I thought this one was pretty helpful. It's pretty simple. We're going to start on the surface and work in. And so on the surface is what we call behavior, what is done. Obviously, the things on the surface of the earth are things you can observe, right? You look, you see. They're obvious, they're visible. So the most basic way of studying a culture is to observe. Look, listen, taste, feel, all that stuff. But on a deeper level, underlying those behaviors are values. Why do people behave the way they do? Because there are certain things they value, right? If somebody 1,000 years from now, if Christ doesn't come back, I think he will, but if he doesn't, they come back and they dig up, you know, Ankeny, Iowa, they'll say, oh, okay, there's middle class people, some of them upper middle class. And so obviously they valued, you know, possessions and nice homes and things like that, all right? What do you suppose would come underneath that? What undergirds a value system? You value things because, yes, you believe them. So the reason that you value certain things is because you believe in certain things. And so if something is an important belief, it will reveal itself in the way, in what you value, and ultimately in the way that you behave. Okay, and that asks the question, what is true? And then the fourth and final one would be what? What would be at the core? What's the buzzword we use nowadays to kind of capsulize a belief system? Yeah, worldview. Yep. A worldview asks, what is real? Now, again, these are very basic, okay? But at least it gives us a starting point. So what I consider to be real, is going to determine what I consider to be true. Now you say, well, wait a minute, real are things you can observe. Well, not everywhere. If you're a Hindu, okay, and you're traditional practicing Hindu, you believe the Vedas and all that, you will believe that nothing really is real as we understand it. Everything is an illusion. See, so we Westerners take for granted that if you can see it, it's real. But not everybody who sees things believes that they are real. To some, they are illusions, and there's a reality beyond. And only when you become enlightened will you understand that reality. So all this has to do with belief systems and cultures. All right? Okay. Now, I asked you to define culture the other day, and so I'm just going to add a few. I'm not going to ask you to reiterate what you already said. But here are a few. And I give these to you, right? In the notes, they're there, yeah. Beliefs, customs, arts, etc., of a particular society, group, place, or time. So what's Merriam-Webster doing? Just trying to grab a few of the essentials. They're not necessarily being exhaustive. Great courses, and that's where your book comes from, David Livermore. He did a course on the great courses. And he says it's an organized set of beliefs, values, customs, and behaviors separating one group from another. Again, very basic. Life science says the characteristics of a particular group of people defined by everything from language, religion, cuisine, social habits, music, and arts. Now, I don't know why they separated music and arts, because I've always understood music to be one of the arts, but I don't know, maybe there's a reason for that. Dictionary.com, the quality in a person or society that arises from a concern for what is regarded as excellent in arts, letters, manners, scholarly pursuits, etc. The Free Dictionary, the totality of socially transmitted behavior patterns, arts, beliefs, institutions, and all other products of human work and thought, just not to leave anything out. University of Minnesota, the shared patterns of behaviors and interactions, cognitive constructs, and effective understanding that are learned through a process of socialization. Then you got a guy like Geert Hofstede, who really boils it down. It's the software of the mind. Now, Geert Hofstede is a pioneer in cultural studies. So, don't assume that because this is a really simplistic definition that this guy really wasn't involved. He was greatly, deeply involved in cultural studies. In fact, even Christians will mine some of the things that he's researched about culture, but he wanted to make it as simple as possible, the software of the mind. All right. I got a question for you that's not in the notes, but I decided it would be important for our discussion. Do you believe that culture is amoral, which of course means it doesn't have a moral, it's neutral, it's not moral or immoral, it's amoral. Do you believe that that's true of culture? There's nothing right or wrong about culture in and of itself that we're asking. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. 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 All right. Good. Somebody else add to that. It's a good comment. Okay? All right? Okay? All right? Yeah. What we're struggling here is to decide, is the presence of sin culture, or is culture simply a vehicle through which right and wrong manifest themselves? Do you understand the difference? Let me repeat that. Is the idea of culture in and of itself right or wrong? In other words, does it contain right or wrong? Or is culture simply an innocent vehicle through which cultural values, moral values, can be transmitted? That's what we're dealing with. So we're going to be talking about 10 cultural values in the first half of this semester. Okay, and if you were in Intro to Missions, you remember we presented those in a very cursory fashion. And I made the statement there, and I'll repeat it here, that those values, in other words, for example, the very first one, individualism versus collectivism, those concepts are not right or wrong in and of themselves. If the fact that one culture is more individualistic and another culture is more collectivistic in its orientation are not right and wrong in and of themselves. But the values and belief system of people which are tainted by sin will be manifested in the context of an individualist or a collectivist. Now, if that's a little fuzzy right now, just give it some time to simmer. As we work through these, I think it'll become clearer. Okay? Culture is a vehicle through which values are manifested. All right? And every culture does it a little differently. Okay? But they are tools, means by which a culture expresses its morality. Every culture has morality. Okay? But that morality is expressed through the vehicle of culture. Does that make sense? All right. Let that simmer a little bit. Now, there are lots of different kinds of cultures, and you can fill this in real quickly, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. But if I say, what is culture? Well, it depends. There are national cultures. There is a German culture. There's an American culture. There's a Brazilian culture, okay? There are ethnic cultures. There is a black culture. There is a Mexican culture. There is, you can use ethnic terms to describe cultural nuances. Professional culture. There is a medical culture. There is an educational culture, all right? See, there is an aviation culture. And the fact is, if you're in an aviation culture, as you are, you know how to act and what you know what to say because you know what those people are thinking and how they act. Organizational cultures. Maybe you're part of an organization, maybe an on-campus group, for instance, of some sort. And in that organization, you know, there are certain norms that you just understand. Generational. I'm from a different culture than you are, generationally. I'm 62. You're probably not even 50 yet. Hope not. Religious cultures. When you walk into a Baptist church, do you have to figure out how to act? And no, you know, because you grew up in that, or at least most of you did. But walk into a Sikh temple down in Des Moines. What do? Take off your shoes or not? Do I sit? Do I stand? Do I shake hands? You're not sure, because there are cultures religiously that dictate those things. Ideological culture. Give me an example of an ideology. Marxism, capitalism, Nazism, those are ideologies out there that also manifest themselves as cultures. All right? Political. Ooh, you think there's a Republican culture and a Democratic culture? Yeah, politically, you better believe it. And then you have people that, you know, don't want to associate with either one, so they create another culture called, you know, you name it. All right? Regional cultures. Here in our country, give me an example of regional culture. Yeah, Midwest, whatever that is. There are different opinions about what the Midwest is. Yeah. South, the South, from the South, the Northeast. Then there's California. It's a state, but it's a culture all by itself, right? So, you see, when you say culture, what do you mean? And it's important that you understand, because sometimes you get those mixed up, right? Okay. For instance, looking at World War II, a German person would be very offended if you referred to his culture, back in the 1940s as a Nazi culture. Say, well, no. Nazism was an invasion into the German culture. It wasn't part of their culture. So there you have the mixing of a political and a national culture. You have to be careful about that. Okay. All right. And by the way, all of us are parts of various of these, and they all kind of mix together to make you who you are. Okay. All right, different types of intelligence. All right, make sure we're on the next section here. When we talk about cultural intelligence, what are we talking about? Well, there are different types of intelligence that have been developed out there. IQ is the most obvious one. Intelligence quotient. Now, I've been told, anybody here ever taken an IQ test? Anybody done it? I've never taken one. Okay. I've been told that IQ is fairly fixed in a person. It's not something you develop. You can develop the potential within your IQ, but research seems to show that IQ is fairly fixed at birth, and then you learn and act within that. So I'm not an expert on that. Then there's the one that's fairly new study, a lot newer than IQ, and that's emotional intelligence. And that has to do with the way that people react emotionally in their cultures, in their society. And there have been some in-depth studies done about that. Okay? And of course, a lot of that has to do with personality as well. Some personalities are more emotionally driven. Some cultures are more emotionally driven. And then there's SQ, which is social intelligence, and that's another study of its own that takes different elements of society and analyzes people within those. And then we get the CQ, which is cultural intelligence. Now you know why we have a Q in there. Cultural intelligence, you say, where'd the Q come from? It came from the intelligence quotient, the IQ. Everybody else just kind of got on board with that, see? Emotional quotient, social quotient, cultural quotient, well, we don't call it that. But that's why it's called CQ, all right? All right, so again, we're focusing on this one down here. Essentially, cultural intelligence asks the question, how do I learn how to adapt and live in a culture different than my own? That's really what we're after here. Why is this part of our curriculum? Because we're trying to prepare people to interact and live, survive, thrive within different cultural settings. Some of you have experienced that firsthand. You're not living in your normal culture, okay? So, you have an edge on that. So, what is cultural intelligence? Well, if you go on their website, culturalq.com is the website, you'll see that it's defined as the capability to relate and work effectively in culturally diverse situations. Look, just about anybody can survive in another culture. But we're talking about the difference between merely surviving in a culture and thriving in another culture. And the goal of cultural intelligence is to teach you how to thrive. And then, this statement I found interesting. Cultural intelligence is the capability to relate and work effectively, the second session. Global CQ can best be described as working and relating effectively across international differences. Domestic CQ, see there's international and domestic. Domestic CQ can best be described as working and relating effectively with people from different cultural backgrounds in your own country. So, Pam, you come here. You're from a different culture, now you're in my culture. That's domestic CQ from my vantage point. From your vantage point, it's international CQ because you're looking at it as a foreigner. I'm looking at it as a resident here who's interacting with a foreigner. That makes sense? So for one person, it's international. For the other person, it's domestic. But they're learning how to interact with each other. Okay? Some misconceptions about what cultural intelligence is. It's not a natural born trait. You're not born with it. Now you say, well, if I'm born with a more outgoing personality, doesn't that give me an advantage? Not necessarily. We make the mistake sometimes of thinking that people who are more outgoing are naturally going to do better in other cultures. Not necessarily. Because sometimes people who are very outgoing can also be very shallow in their relationships and in their way of doing things. Whereas people who are more reserved are often more analytical, they're deeper thinkers, and they actually do better. Not always, okay? I'm just saying that the fact that you're more outgoing or less outgoing does not make you more or less capable of thriving in a different culture. It's not the issue, okay? It isn't the sum of the first three. If I have high intelligence quotient and high emotional and social intelligence, I'll do well. Now, those things may help you, but they do not automatically make you more culturally intelligent, okay? Look at, you all know the story of Gladys Aylward, right? She was rejected by the mission agency because she wasn't prepared academically, didn't know her theology stuff. But man, she went to China, and did she fit in? Okay, she did a fantastic job there. It's more than this. 3, it isn't the fact that you have visited a lot of different countries. How many of you have been to, let's say, besides your own country, you've been to at least 3 other countries on a visit? Anybody? Several of you have. Okay. 4 different countries? All right. If we'd have taken this little poll when I was in college, you wouldn't get this kind of response. And that's really good, and it's helpful to do that, but we have to be sure that we understand that visiting a lot of different countries doesn't automatically make a person culturally intelligent. Because cultural intelligence is learning how to interact in those countries, not just to say, I've been there. And by the way, I'm not dissing you guys who've done that. I've been to several different countries myself, but that doesn't make me culturally intelligent. Okay. It isn't just being humble and respectful of people from other cultures. Now, it is good to be humble and respectful. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but the fact that you do that doesn't automatically make you culturally intelligent. All right. And then it isn't emphasizing cultural similarities and avoiding the differences. A lot of times when people visit another country, the first thing they do by default is to find out where's the common ground. Now, why do we do that? Why do you start looking for common ground when you're in a different place? Yeah. If you're totally disconnected from everything, if everything's foreign to you, there's almost a panic feeling like, I've got to find something I can attach to, something that I have in common with somebody else. So it's only natural to do that, and it's not wrong to do that, okay? But one of the dangers of looking for common ground is that sometimes you think you found common ground only to discover later on that what you perceived as being the same was very different, okay? And maybe that's even happened to you. Somebody smiles at you and is oh, they're getting it. They love what I'm saying. And then you find out later on, no, the reason they were smiling is because they were just being polite. They come from a very respectful culture. And in that culture, anytime there's a visitor, you smile, you act interested because that's a way of showing respect, even if you couldn't care less what the person was talking about. See? So, or the opposite can happen. You get in a place and they won't even look at you. And you're trying to interact, and there's no eye contact, and they're looking down the whole time. You think, man, I am just absolutely a zero. I'm blowing this. And then you find out later that the reason they didn't look at you is because they would consider that disrespectful. Out of respect for you, they looked at their paper, they looked at the course, and they were very engaged. But it just didn't appear that way to you as a Westerner. So all these things are possible misconceptions when it comes to cultural intelligence. Anybody ever have that happen where you thought that a person in another culture was responding in one way only to find out later that it was just the opposite? Ever have that happen? I don't know if you want to share an example or not. I don't want to embarrass anybody, but you're welcome to. Yeah. Interesting. When you as a Westerner hear, most of us, we think, okay, that was boring, Yeah. But in this case, no, they were acknowledging that they understood. Yeah? Anybody else want to share one? Yeah, Pam. Interesting. So what does that person mean by saying, I don't care? Exactly. But you're hearing that and thinking, they don't care about me. Yeah. And that would go right over most of our heads. You know, you'd say that, we don't even give it a second thought. Good. Anybody else want to share something like that? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Good. Yeah. And how many times have you heard somebody say, why do we say how are you if you don't really care what the answer is? Well, every culture has that kind of expression where you're not really asking to sit down and tell me how you're doing. It's just a way of greeting. It's a form of greeting. And every culture has that in some way. In Portuguese, como vai, just like in Spanish. I'm not expecting the person to sit down and say, well, let me tell you how I really am. It's a form of greeting. Yeah, that's true. Okay, good. Anybody else? These are all good. Very helpful. All right. The important thing is that we're aware that these things do happen, and we be ready to understand that. And if we mess up, we're willing to say, I'm sorry. Now, let me tell you something. From my experience in Brazil, you can over-apologize in another culture. I was guilty of that. They laughed at me for it. They made jokes at me about it. The Brazilians love to imitate people. And I was super sensitive about not offending their culture. So anytime I sensed that I had offended somebody or said something wrong, I'd say, oh, desculpe, which means I'm sorry. Desculpe. So one day they were doing skits and they did skits of different professors. And so they grabbed one of the guys grabbed his briefcase and walked into class, and said, oh, desculpe. And what I learned is in Brazil, if you want to apologize, you apologize for something major. If it's not something major, you don't have to fall over yourself saying, oh, I'm sorry. See? And so, just take that as understand now in some cultures it may be important to be a little bit more expressive that way. But anyway, we had lots of fun. So now we went through this in Intro to Missions. You remember this? Okay, why did the prodigal son end up in the pig pen? So let's just run. You all remember this from okay, so I'm just going to go through this quickly. The American pastor, what's his reason? What's his answer to the question? Why did the prodigal end up in the pig pen? What's the American pastor going to say? Well, you're an American. Well, some of you. Those of you who are Americans, what will the Americans say? Any American, not just a pastor. Yeah. Yep. Squandered his inheritance. It's his own, you make your bed, you sleep in it, right? You had your inheritance, you went out and squandered it. Now, Tanzanian pastor, okay? Now, if you say, well, I don't know anything about Tanzanian culture, then it might be difficult to understand his answer. Anybody happen to remember what the Tanzanian pastor said? I know this is probably going back a ways for most of you. The Tanzanian pastor says, nobody gave me anything to eat. Yeah, the American pastor, was a question of personal responsibility. The Tanzanian pastor comes from a culture where you see somebody in need, you help them. We're community. It's very collectivistic. And the fact is, the community let this guy down. So we call this community involvement or community even responsibility. This shouldn't happen. People should see that and feed this guy. The Indian pastor, and again, you understand that these are simplistic answers, okay? It's not that every Indian pastor, every Tanzanian pastor is going to think this way, but as a general rule, this would be representative. He dishonored his family, that's why. Family's huge in India. Whoever the oldest living patriarch is, he's the boss. He can be the great-grandpappy, but as long as he's alive and thinking, he's still in charge. And the fact is, this guy dishonored his family. And in fact, I heard one missionary to India say that the Indian people would say, the family had a responsibility to go after him, pursue him. I knew an Indian pastor whose daughter moved away. She went through a divorce, and she ended up moving to a different city. And he sent her two brothers, his two sons, after her to bring her back. Now, she didn't come. She refused to come back. But he felt his responsibility was to go after her. He sent his two sons. They're all adults. To bring her back. Family connection. So that's domestic. It's a domestic reaction in this case. And the Russian pastor said it's because there was a famine in the land. When we get to the cluster of that part of the world, we'll talk a lot about nomadic activity and climate change and famines and all that have influenced their lives over the centuries. And he says, look, there was a famine. Does the Bible say there was a famine? Yeah, it does. So he's looking at circumstances. Now, all of those are part of the story. Theologically, which one, in the end, is the point that Jesus is trying to make? What's the real point of the story in the end? Let me start by asking this. If you were to ask Jesus, he told the story, right? Jesus, why did the prodigal son end up in the pig pen? What would Jesus tell you? Let's see, Jesus was from Israel. What do you think Jesus was? What was the point Jesus was making, Pam? Okay, so you're saying that Jesus would point out the personal responsibility of the prodigal in this case. And I think you're right. In other words, there are times when a theological understanding of a passage has to supersede the cultural implications. You can't interpret Bible passages primarily on cultural implications. You have to consider the culture, but the understanding of your theology and your doctrine has to be your number one consideration. And you're right, Jesus is pointing out, but of course there's another point that Jesus wants to make. When this guy comes back and he's reconciled, he really points the finger at the older brother that refuses to accept him back. And that kind of jabs the Pharisees who are listening. See? Okay, so the fact that there are cultural nuances here doesn't mean that we have to change our theology to fit the culture. No. That's the tail wagging the dog, and we don't want to do that. Okay? All right. So what leads to high CQ, cultural intelligence? Well, drive. You ever gone to a foreign country that you just didn't really want to go to? You went because for whatever reason, maybe somebody wanted you to go over, but you just really didn't. I'm not asking for testimony. But if that ever happens, it can be an absolute nightmare. It can be a drudgery. And if there's no motivation there, you're probably just wanting to get through the experience and get home as soon as possible. I hope that never happens to any of you. Maybe coming to Bible college for some was that kind of an experience. I don't know. But there has to be motivation, okay? And then there needs to be knowledge. You need to understand something about the culture objectively. What are some things that you could do to learn more about a culture before visiting it? Pardon? Yeah, research. What kinds of research could you access? Okay, yeah, Google search will give you lots of stuff. Give me some specific types of research you could. Okay. Good. If you happen to know somebody that's from there, even before you travel, take them out to lunch. Say, hey, I need to talk to you. I'm going to be going there. Give me some advice. Watch news. You can find news from almost any country around the world. It may be slanted, but at least it gives you an idea. What about watching a movie that's based on? Watch Fiddler on the Roof if you want to go to Israel. There's a lot of really cultural depth in that movie. It really is. Not to mention the music. That was that Isaac Stearns that did that, or Yitzhak Perlman? I think it was Isaac Stearns that played the violin in that movie. We got to go and hear Gil Shaham play the violin at the Des Moines Symphony a couple years ago. Man, short Jewish guy, but man, one of the top violinists in all the world. In fact, there was a time when the top 3 violinists in all the world were Jewish guys. Yitzhak Perlman, Isaac Stearns, and Gil Shaham. Amazing, absolutely amazing. Okay, anyway, get out there and get some information. High CQ strategy. Now, what are we talking about here? You don't just walk off the plane into a college and say, well, let's see what happens. There will be plenty of opportunities for that to happen, believe me. There'll be plenty of unplanned things that'll happen, and you'll just have to say, okay, let's see how this comes out. But you don't want to approach it that way. You want to have a strategy. And gratefully, most mission agencies will help you with that. They give you books to read. They put you in contact with people that live there. They give you some sources that you can, for strategy. Learning languages. I mean, there was a time in Brazil, 2 generations before mine. No, 1 generation, the generation that preceded mine, when they went to Brazil to learn the language, the rule was, okay, you got 1 year to learn or you're coming home. The guy that was in charge, that's the way he handled it. He said, this was the guy in Brazil. He said, you got 1 year to learn. If you're not fluent in a year, you're out of here. Figure it out. Well, by the time I went, man, they had a whole course. They called them cycles. We went through 32 cycles, and we found an informant that was approved by the missionaries on the field, and we studied with them a very, very different situation. Strategy. See? High CQ action. Adapting is needed during cross-cultural encounters. Okay, what we're saying here is the strategy says, this is what I'm going to try in order to learn the language. Okay, does it work or if it doesn't? If it doesn't work, I'm willing to adapt and try something different. For example, I decided I was going to try to bond with the Brazilians by cheering against the United States in a Brazil-U.S. soccer game. We were sitting in the home of one of my colleagues, and a bunch of Brazilians there. And this was in one of the World Cups back in 90 or 92, I can't remember. U.S. is playing Brazil. Well, what chance does the U.S. have to win at that point? But I decided, okay, I'm going to get on their good side. So I cheered for Brazil. And they're looking at me like, what's wrong with you? Aren't you an American? And I thought, oops. They viewed me as a traitor to my own country, and that did not impress them. In fact, I think they sensed that I was trying to warm up to them, and they resented it. Now, I didn't lose their friendship or anything, but I did learn a good lesson that day. I'm an American, I can be an American. So I had to adapt. Next time they played, I cheered for U.S. Lost again. See, so don't kick yourself and decide to quit, if you mess up. You cannot learn a new culture without messing up. Right, Lana? Right, Pam? You come to another culture, and you're going to mess up. And that's just part of it. The only person that entered a new culture and never messed up was Jesus. But we're not Jesus. Okay, now these are logically ordered, okay? In other words, you have a high CQ drive, find someone who represents your other. Pam, you mentioned trying to find somebody who's from that country, the other culture, all right? And have lunch together. Are you excited about getting together with this person for lunch? Compare perspectives. Are you interested in the other person's worldview and opinions on various topics? If you go to lunch with somebody from another culture, don't spend all the time talking about you and your background. Ask them questions. That's how you learn. And that will show them that you're interested in learning their culture too. Okay? Learn from your differences. You don't have to become like somebody in another culture in order to work well together. You just have to learn how to work well together with your different. In fact, sometimes those differences actually become benefits. Okay? Just like 2 people have the same personality can clash, 2 people of the same culture may clash. Sometimes 2 different cultures actually facilitate a good working relationship. So don't feel like you've got to become, whatever culture you're in. Just understand that 2 of you need to work together, give and take. Okay. High CQ knowledge. How much do you know about the history, politics, religion, current events, arts, literature, et cetera, of the other culture? How much do you understand how these things have shaped the culture to what it is today? Oops, sorry. Let me get back to that for you. Again, take an interest in learning. When I went to Brazil, I was required to read a book about this thick called Rebellion in the Backlands. I was in northeast Brazil. Okay, I thought, why are they making me read this book? I'm trying to learn the language. Rebellion in the Backlands was a history, a very famous history in Brazil of northeast Brazil. That whole region up in the northeast, I would better understand by reading that book. And the missionaries understood the importance of having some. So if I'm talking to a Brazilian about their history, and I can say something about so-and-so that lived back then, they're going to say, oh, he's interested in my history. If somebody comes here to visit and they know absolutely nothing about anything that ever happened in American history, you might wonder, are they really interested in who we are? See, same thing is true if you go to visit another country. All right. High CQ strategy. It stems from metacognition. What in the world is metacognition? You guys ever met that word in another class? Metacognition is higher order thinking ability. In other words, metacognition is the ability to think just beyond what you observe, but you analyze. You say, okay, based on this, I'm going to act this way, or I'm going to do that, or I'm going to go there. That's the idea of metacognition, being able to think on a deeper level. It's similar to driving to new and unusual places. If you go to a new place, especially if it's interesting looking, you slow down. Why? Because you've never been there before. And you're slowing down, you're taking it all in, and cars are going zoom right around you, zoom, zoom. Why? Because they do that every day. They see that stuff all the time, And so they know it. But you're there for the first time, so you're slowing down, you're taking it in. You notice what's going on. To them, it's second nature. They don't pay attention to it because they grew up with it. And then you consider your next steps. What can I do from here? Yeah. You ever notice that sometimes when somebody comes as a new person to the United States, they'll comment on a lot of little details because they're things that are new to them. And sometimes you'll think, yeah, I never even noticed that before myself, and I grew up here. Because it's all second nature to us. Use the anthropologist mantra. I wonder why that is. I wonder what. Now, again, a word of caution to you guys. Don't irritate people in the new culture by constantly asking, what's that? What's that mean? What's that? Can you translate that? You'll drive them nuts, okay? So, but don't be afraid to ask questions, all right? Yeah. Did you know, well, let me ask you this. Do you consider yourself an expert of your own culture? I don't. There are things about the American culture I don't understand. Of course, our culture is also changing so quickly. But the fact is, we're not just learning another culture. We are not experts even of our own culture. And it's kind of like language. So you try to learn another language. Well, you don't even know English grammar. What are you trying to learn another language for, you know enough of English grammar to speak the language, but the same thing is true with cultures. Okay, then high CQ action, knowing when and how much to adapt. And we talked about that. I'm just kind of giving you a little bit extra on this. Get hands-on experience. Nothing like hands-on. You can read about it, but if you get a chance to experience it, you can read all you want about feijoada in Brazil. Feijoada is rice with all sorts of interesting ingredients. And it comes from back in the old colonial days. The English were in Brazil, and they were eating like kings and queens, and they'd throw their scraps away, and the slaves would jump over the fence and grab the scraps, and they'd throw them together, and they made a feijoada. So feijoada is, of course, now they're not scraps, but it's full of all sorts of interesting things that why are those things put together? That's the reason why, because it's symbolic it's commemorative of what people did in those days. All right. Try to speak a few words. What's the best example of somebody persevering in learning a language? What's the best example you could use of insistence on learning to speak? You want to give somebody a good example of what it means to persevere, to be determined to speak a language. What example would you use? Yep. Absolutely. A 1-year-old. Yep. Anybody here ever met a normal 1-year-old that just said, I give up, I quit, this is not worth the struggle? Doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. And you ever stop, when's the last time a 1-year-old said, if you're going to insult me about the way I speak, then I'm not going to try anymore? They don't even consider that. They have one thing on the brain, and that is, I'm going to speak. And they don't even think about why. It's just natural. And if you're going to learn another culture, if you're going to spend significant time in another culture, you're going to have to become a 1-year-old again. And just say, now, in some cultures, it's easier. Latin America, no problem. We laugh together. I said things that I can't even repeat here because I said the wrong word. Oops. and so what am I going to do? Go home and, well, they laughed at me today, honey. That's the way it's going to be. I'm going to go home. I'm going to go surf someplace where they appreciate me. No, I learned to laugh. I love to laugh anyway. And we laughed and we laughed. And I mean, years after, I would have graduates who were in the ministry come back and say, hey, do you remember when? Yeah, I remember when. Oh, man. Yeah. And if I had time, I'd share with some of those with you. But what is it, 11:50, okay. All right. Yeah, be prepared to laugh at yourself. Now, in some cultures, they won't laugh at you, okay? In Germanic cultures, by and large, they won't, at least if they don't know you very well. The thing about Latins, and again, I'm being very stereotypical here, but Latin Americans in general will warm up to you quickly, and they'll laugh at, you don't have to have a deep relationship in order for them to feel free to laugh at you. Normally, not always. Okay, you've probably seen something like this. In fact, Mr. Baldwin uses almost the same exact graphic when he talks about organizational leadership. This is very, very helpful. As you know, an iceberg is a whole lot bigger than what appears. So all you see is what sticks up above the water, and that corresponds to, see those same 4 elements we saw in the cutout of the earth? Behavior, values, beliefs, and worldview. It's just another way of putting it. So our job in learning a new culture is to get under the water and to start understanding these elements that help us to understand why. Why do they dress that way? Why do they eat this food? Why don't they go there? Why? All right. That all takes time. Why do they drive on that side of the road? Don't ever ask somebody in another culture why they drive on the wrong side of the road. And don't ever go to England and ask them why they speak with a British accent. Oh, man, you want to get in big trouble. Okay? There are just certain things that common sense should tell you don't do, but I've done. And you learn to laugh. See, just because it seems, left side of the road seems weird to you, right? But now, this little thing in the bottom right, it's really important you get that, because you need to be careful in another culture that you don't mistake personality for culture. In other words, let's say that you went to Peru, okay? And let's say that you stayed with a family for a week in Peru, and it was a very, very quiet family, very reserved, okay? Not a lot of conversation, very, very timid. And that was your experience in Peru. You go home, and you're reporting to people, oh yeah, the Peruvians are very quiet. Peruvians they hardly like to talk. They're really shy. Somebody's gonna look at you and say, where'd you say you went? Right? Because what you've done is you've allowed a personality trait to interpret the culture for you. And if you do that, you might find that you've done it wrong, okay? And sometimes it's even the region you go to. Have you ever noticed, if you talk to Mrs. Taylor, she'll normally stand closer to you than somebody else who's talking to you, just because she's from the South. I noticed that. We call that, there's a technical term for the distance that you stand. I'll think of it, I'll show you later. And so even in our own country, there's a difference from region to region in the way that that people conduct themselves. And a lot of that's personality too. Here's another way of looking at the same thing. I got this from an article by Charles Kraft. It's a lot like the iceberg illustration. Surface level and then deep level culture. So take your scuba diving gear culturally with you and dive in. Make sure you come up for air once in a while. Now, what's that? Well, what do you think I mean by that? Thinking of cultures. Well, what are the three primary colors, or are there still three? Anybody artist here? Have you studied that? What are the three primary colors? Yeah, aren't they red, blue, and yellow? You make green by putting blue and yellow together. Now you buy a printer and they got these different words now, right? Like you got weird, but they still use like three. Okay, so what's the point of this? Yeah. Right. Right. The basic message of this slide is don't oversimplify culture. A culture is either red, yellow, or blue. Well, no. And of course, this is even an oversimplification. There are lots and lots of variations. So be careful when you refer to the culture of even Japan. And Lana, I've not been to a lot of regions of Japan. Would it be correct to say that geographically in different areas of Japan, cultures are different? Hokkaido, would that be a little different than like Tokyo culture? Yeah. So even in the same culture. So I'm not saying you shouldn't refer to the culture of Germany or the culture of Bangladesh or whatever. I'm just saying when you do that, be careful to understand that there are going to be differences even within that culture. And that's the idea of this graph. Okay. So let's just a minute. Let me just, before I get into that, let me just make sure that I didn't miss anything else in the introduction to the notes here. I think I may have. Nope. Okay, got it. All right, let's jump into this. Usually the class is scheduled. Oh dear. Oh, wow. How long has that been dangling there? Has it been a while? Oh no. Excuse me. Okay, I think we're good. Now what? Okay. What happened? When are you praying for an early dismissal or something today? Okay, here we go. I don't know what happened. All right, let's jump into the first culture. And there is some introductory stuff even here, but again, this is something you've probably seen from our course in Intro to Missions. All right? We're talking about identity. Now, why do we start with identity? Well, first of all, let me say that not everybody has the same number of cultural values. Actually, when Geert Hofstede, whom I mentioned earlier, and others started really pioneering the study of cultural values and how to analyze them, they came up with about 6. This study contains 10. And the reason it contains 10 is because I really gleaned my information from David Livermore and his course, his research on this. So there is not a magic number of how many cultural values there are. We're going to go with 10. But just understand that not everybody has the same analysis. Another thing I want to say about them is that these differences, and we're going to present 2 contrasts for each one of these cultural values. These contrasts are not intended to be right, wrong, moral, immoral, good, bad, okay? No, they are neutral. Again, it's the way that people apply them with their moral, presuppositions that are going to make the difference. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So, what are we talking about? Collectivism versus individualism, okay? And why do we present this one first? It is largely, almost universally considered to be the most foundational of all the other cultural values. In other words, it has more in common with all of the other cultural expressions that we're going to study than any other single characteristic value, okay? The fact that you are an individualist or a collectivist is going to make a great impact on the way that other values express themselves. All right, so here are the ones that we'll start with this one, but these are the values that we're going to study, okay? And again, we ran through these in intro to missions, but we're going to camp on them a lot more here. All right, and there they are, okay? You don't have to write them all down now. I'll present this list as we go along. Identity. All right, I like this because, well, let me see if you can read my mind. Does anybody have any idea what I want to do here? I have no clue what you're up to. Pardon? Yeah. What does the word search have to do with what we're talking about? Any idea what's going to be in the word search? Yep, you got it. Those 10 cultural values I just showed you on the last slide are hidden in the word search. So why did I put them in a word search? Yeah. We're talking about things that aren't immediately obvious to everybody. They're hidden, but they're all present. Now, which word did you catch first? Okay, got those. Yeah. You're good with it. Do you like word searches? Yeah. See, so the idea here is that we're going to bring out values that exist in every culture. And when we bring them out, you'll say, oh, yeah, I'm aware of that. But the fact that you become aware of them when we talk about them doesn't necessarily mean that you have studied them, analyzed them, and considered them in time past. Because they're all natural, normal, everyday parts of culture. Every culture possesses all of these. And so when we begin to study them, we begin to draw attention to them specifically. Risk, lifestyle, some are backwards, some are forwards. I actually even accidentally left out the I in social norms, so you can see I sneaked the I in there, right there. You might not even have noticed that if I hadn't have said so. Okay, so there they are. I just put the words in and let the word search generate it automatically. But so that's what we're doing here. We're drawing attention to things that have always existed, that you guys practice. It's part of our lives, part of who we are. But we haven't always taken time to say, oh, okay, so that's why we do this or say that or eat that. That's the idea here. So now, notice my little caveat there, try. We will not avoid stereotypes in this discussion, okay? Every country, every culture we talk about, we will stereotype. It's just going to happen. You can't, you might as well forget the class altogether. So what we try to do is recognize that we're being stereotypical and minimize it as much as we can. But we're going to stereotype cultures. You know, what's an American? Well, you know, what's a pilot like? We're going to talk about professional cultures. Well, they're really smart. They got to learn a lot of, you know, there are exceptions to the rule, I understand. You're not one of them, okay? All right. Now, there are lots of maps like this up there, and the resolution isn't the greatest. I apologize for that, but at least it helps. Okay, the lighter the color on this atlas, the more collectivistic. The darker the color, the more individualistic. So obviously, you see North America, British Isles, and in general Great Britain, and Australia. Those are the three Anglo clusters that we'll talk about later, and they're the most individualistic as well, okay? Now, the white spaces are countries that did not respond to the research, that people sent out questionnaires and stuff, and not everybody turned in a result, okay? But by and large, would you say that this is in general, it's lighter or darker? What's the dominant? There are, yeah, I mean, huge, yeah. I would say middle is probably the most dominant, and then it gets lighter. The darker areas are, I mean, there's a huge area right here, but a lot of this is almost uninhabited. You know, I shouldn't say that. There are people who live there, but stereotype. Okay, and so anyway, but there is a lot more collectivism in the world than there is individualism. That is, and most of this is the West. The West is North America and Western Europe. But even not even all of Western Europe is individualistic. Okay, so if you guys study Maslow's law, okay, so you know all this, right? And of course, the ultimate goal of Maslow's law, Maslow's law is self-actualization. What does that mean? I am who I'm meant to be, or you could even say, I am who I've decided to be. That's coming under attack. But it's all about you. You know, when I was a kid, there was a commercial for the Army on TV, and it's, be all that you can be, find your future in the Army. Okay? And there was another commercial, have it your way, have it your way, have it your way at Burger King. These are, it's funny how commercials stick with you. These are all, I heard these when I was 12. Yep. Individualism, right? Nike, just do it. Doesn't matter what anybody thinks, what anybody says, just do it, right? Those are all individual. Can you think of any other slogans that are individualistic? Pardon? Follow your heart. Yeah, good. Any others come to mind? I'm sorry, I didn't hear it. Oh, you only live once. Excuse me. I can't hear as well as I used to. Sometimes I think my hearing is. Yeah, you only. Yeah. Or if you want a beer commercial from when I was a kid, you only go around once. That was, give it all the gusto you have. And don't take that seriously, but that was the commercial. How about collectivism? Can you think of any slogans that are collectivistic in their orientation? Yeah. Now, here's a question for you. Do they do that on the commercial because we are a collectivistic culture, or because they want to collect business? See, there's a case, of course I think it's the latter, there's the case, the idea they're using a collectivistic idea in an individualistic culture to encourage people to get on board with their product. So it's an economic motivation that produces a collectivistic commercial. Huh? That's what you got to watch out for that. Somebody could come over like, oh, this is a collectivistic country. Look, they're all joining together and drinking Coke. Well, it's not exactly what that means, but you're right. It does present that image. Okay. Okay, so you go back to like an organizational kind of culture that we talked about, and within that, yeah. Give me an example of a highly collectivistic element in the United States. You mentioned one there in the school system, yeah. Sports. So I miss a layup at the end of the game and we lose. I go back and say, I lost the game. What does the coach say to me? We win together and we lose together. Exactly. Exactly. That's collectivistic. We're individualistic as a culture, but within that, there are pockets of collectivism. What's the most collectivistic element of any culture, with very few exceptions? Family. It's the core. And that's not by accident. God created society that way, right? Can you give me another example of collectivism within the individualistic America? Yeah. Yep. Join hands to, yep. Rallies, political rallies are very collectivistic. Yeah, exactly. Yep. Yep. We stick together. Yep. How about military? You know, you lose your, I mean, part of the purpose of boot camp is to strip you of your personal identity. You become one of us now. Anybody here ever watched The Miracle, the movie The Miracle, about the U.S. ice hockey team beating the Russian team in the it's a really, really good movie. It's a true story about when the U.S. beat the Russian team back in 1970s or 80s. Anyway, a big element in that movie that plays a big part in their winning the gold medal is the coach. He ran those guys ragged in practice until they were willing to say, he would run them ragged, you know, line drills and things on the ice, and he'd stop and he'd say, "Who do you play for?" Some of these guys were diehards of their college. "I play for the University of whatever," and so we could make him run again. And his assistant coach was even getting worried, like, these guys are going to get injured they're getting so tired. Somebody's going to get injured. And he just ignored it. He kept running. And one guy especially was hanging on to the very end. Finally, after the last time he had him run, he said, "Who do you play for?" He said, "I play for the United States of America." "Okay, we're done. Go to the showers." What was he doing? He was stripping them of their identity and teaching them that they belong to a group. So there are collectivistic elements in individualistic culture and vice versa. Even within collectivistic cultures, there are individual expressions as well. So there's no such thing as a pure individualism or pure collectivism, or any of those other traits for that matter. That light is shining right on there. I have 5 minutes? All right. I think, here, if Maslow had been a collectivist, I don't really know anything about the guy, but if he was developing a collectivistic scenario here, what would be at the top? Social harmony. That's the difference. In an individualistic culture, you be who you're going to be, right? Self-actualization. In a collectivistic culture, it's all about the group. What is best for the family? What is best for my community? What is best for my country? That's what makes the difference, okay? Social harmony rules. And people are willing to give up individualistic, what we would call rights. In fact, in a collectivistic culture, they don't even use the word rights the way we do here. It's just not part of their vocabulary. Not that they never use it, but it doesn't have the same impact that it has here because they're not thinking about what's good for me. They're thinking about what's good for us, the tribe, the family, the community. Okay. Here's several. We're actually getting a little bit ahead of the notes, which is good because we won't be ahead for long. But I'm not going to read all these. But did I put those in your notes or not? This chart, it's not there? Okay, but if you just glance at them, you can see a lot of the differences between individualism and collectivism. And again, this comes from Geert Hofstede's site. And if you just type, you might want to write his name down. And again, he's not a Christian, so he's not looking at this from a divine standpoint, okay? He's looking at it purely from a socialist, behavioristic standpoint. But that doesn't negate the fact that he's made some very interesting observations about cultures. Yeah. Here. This American dad, I guess he's from Texas, I don't know. "You must learn to think for yourself. You can't always depend on mom and dad." Right? So, baby's born. We're expecting number 7, grandchild. Goes without saying. When baby's born, where's the baby sleep? Yeah, for a short time, and then you move it to its own room. Why do we do that? Because from day one, you're training that child to be independent. In some cultures, the child sleeps in parents' room for a long time, in fact, even in bed and stuff. And sometimes, even in the States, you do that at first, but that's normally for pragmatic reasons because you want to hear the baby cry and you don't want to miss it when it's time to feed and all that. But we are teaching our children from day one to live on their own. Whereas in some cultures, they don't understand that. And the child needs to learn to live in community. And so here's a little boy in Japan, and his dad is saying, you must do what's best for the family. In other words, yes, there is a measure of independence. And Lana, you obviously, you change when you leave home. You are independent, but there's a connection with the family that we often miss in the Western world. And so that's one of the main differences between these two cultures. All right, well, we'll stop here for today. We are a little ahead, like I said, but that's good. It'll give us a little more room for discussion. See you on Tuesday.